Again, welcome everyone. I'm Elaine Garby, Senior Associate Director of Elliott School Alumni Programs and a Master's Alumna of the Elliott School as well. On behalf of the Elliott School of International Affairs, our International Development Studies MA program, and the Seeger Center for Asian Studies, thank you for joining us today for the $1 Trillion War, the U.S. effort to rebuild Afghanistan, featuring alumnus author Abid Amiri and moderated by Dr. Sean Roberts. We're glad to welcome students, alumni, faculty, staff, and guests from across the GW community and beyond. A few housekeeping items before we begin. All of our attendees are muted and cameras are off. Abid and Dr. Roberts will take questions at the end of the discussion, and we hope to get to as many as time permits. Please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. Closed captioning is also being offered, and you may adjust the settings at the bottom of your screen. Finally, this event is being recorded, and the recording link will be shared with attendees after it's been posted on YouTube within the coming week. A few quick notes on alumni programming. There are many ways for alumni to engage in the life of the university. You can be a professional resource to our students and your fellow alumni through our online mentoring platform, Career Connect. And you can volunteer to connect and share your career advice with students over a virtual coffee, among other things. Please check the chat. There will be some links at some point for you to find out more about those. As we begin our third century, we are also strengthening the university's focus on increasing access to a GW education and supporting our best and brightest students, regardless of their background or financial circumstances. We are doing this through the launch of our Open Doors, the Century's initiative for scholarships and fellowships. GW is committed to investing in the next generation of leaders and problem solvers, like our alumnus speaker, Abed Amiri, and helping these talented students overcome the financial obstacles to their dreams. Building a diverse student body from all walks of life by increasing access to the power of higher education is our responsibility for our students and for our nation's future. So let's open doors. Again, to learn more and to support our GW students, please see the chat box for direct links to these opportunities. It is now my pleasure to welcome our guest speaker, Abed Amiri, and our moderator, and Abed's former faculty director, Dr. Sean Roberts. Abed is an Afghan American currently working as an economist in Washington, D.C. He was the policy director for the Ministry of Finance in Afghanistan between 2016 and 2018. Prior to joining the policy department, he was an economic advisor to the Minister of Finance. Abed has a wide range of domestic and international work experience in the development sector. He worked as the Economic Affairs Officer for the Embassy of Afghanistan in DC between 2012 and 2014. Moreover, he has worked for a number of nonprofit organizations based in Washington and Afghanistan. Of course, Abed holds a master's degree in international development studies from the Elliott School, as well as a bachelor's degree in economics and global studies from St. Lawrence University in New York. He has a number of publications, including his work on road reconstruction in post-conflict Afghanistan, A Cure or a Curse, from 2013, and a 2010 article on unemployment in Afghanistan in the Global Journal. Dr. Sean Roberts is a cultural anthropologist with extensive applied experience in international development work, and he joined the Elliott School in 2008 as director of the International Development Studies program. Having conducted ethnographic fieldwork among the Uyghur people of Central Asia and China during the 1990s, he has published extensively on this community in scholarly journals and collected volumes. In addition, he produced a documentary film in 1996 on the community entitled Waiting for Uyghur-stan. From 1998 to 2000, and again from 2002 to 2006, Dr. Roberts worked at the USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, in Central Asia on democracy and governance programs, designing and managing projects in civil society development, political party assistance, community development, independent media strengthening, and electoral assistance. His present research is focused on China's development of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, as well as on democracy development in former Soviet Central Asia. Roberts continues his applied work on the design and evaluation of democracy and governance projects in the former Soviet Union, most recently in Ukraine, where he worked on a USAID project to support decentralization and anti-corruption. Welcome, Abed and Dr. Roberts. I'll now turn it over to you, Abed, to talk a little bit more about your book. Thank you for joining us.
Elaine, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. Dr. Roberts, thank you for being here. Thank you for hosting this. And also thanks to Diane. Diane, you've been very helpful in organizing this event. So, and a special thanks goes to my wife, Huma, who helped me sort of write this book. I'll remiss if I don't mention her name here. So thanks to GW and particularly the Elliott School for giving me this platform to talk about this very important topic today with all of you. So thanks to everyone for participating. It means that you care about Afghanistan and the Afghan people. So it's a very timely topic and a much needed one for Afghanistan at this juncture. We all know what happened last August, on August 15. The Taliban took over Afghanistan. It was a very dark day for me and for millions of Afghans. Since the Taliban took over, more than 20 million people are at the brink of famine. Doctors, teachers, public employees, they haven't been paid for months. Only 17% of the country's health clinics are functional. Medicine is in short supply and schools are closed, and 97% of the population is living below the poverty line, which is $2 a day. So it's a humanitarian disaster that we're faced with. And as a development practitioner, it really pains me for someone who has worked in Afghanistan to see the people there in this very dark and very needy situation. So my book, The $1 Trillion War, is basically that. It helps answer the question of, despite having spent sort of billions of dollars in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, why weren't we able to sort of develop a sustainable economy for Afghans? So today, on August 15, when the regime changed, when the Taliban took over, there's at least something that they could cling on and they could hold on to and at least feed themselves. And that's basically what the $1 Trillion War is about. And to just give you a brief outline of the book, is it's divided into 6 chapters. One of the first chapters is basically dedicated to study the European Recovery Program, the Marshall Plan. And you might wonder as to what does the Marshall Plan have to do with Afghanistan? I'll explain that in a minute. I also studied the US's intention to repeat sort of like a Marshall Plan style development in Afghanistan, initially in 2002. And how did we fail to achieve that? All of us together combined, the international community and Afghans included. I also write about the total human cost and the dollar cost of the war over the 2 decades. There was a lot of blood and treasure that was spent in Afghanistan. And finally, I make recommendations as to how it ought to be channeled to Afghanistan in the future. So we're not faced with the similar situation that we are faced with today, a humanitarian crisis at our hand. So a little bit about Marshall Plan. We all know that Marshall Plan is one of the most successful development projects of the 20th century in post-war countries. I wanted to study Marshall Plan to draw lessons from this model and to study the economic development of the last 20 years of Afghanistan while comparing it to the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, the total cost of Marshall Plan was $13 billion in 1947. So if you accounted for today's dollar, accounted for inflation, it's about $100 billion in today's value. Europe in post-World War II was as destroyed as Afghanistan post 9/11, right when the United States intervened and went to Afghanistan. So Europe, there was very little governance institutions left. Universities did not exist. Infrastructure, roads and bridges were all destroyed. The money was worthless. Food was scarce, and hunger was everywhere, as was in Afghanistan right after when the U.S. intervened post 9/11. There are particularly 4 major components of the Marshall Plan, which was the grants, there were loans, investment guarantees, and also there was counterpart funds. These programs were designed initially to address that humanitarian crisis, that hunger crisis in 1947 and onwards. Later, when the hunger crisis was addressed, the programs were used to jumpstart the economies of these participating countries. There were 16 different European countries that participated in the Marshall Plan. The goal of these programs was to produce goods and to help produce goods and exchange it among these countries to boost sort of like the local economy in Europe. What Marshall Plan did was it increased the aggregate production level of these countries by more than 30% over 5 years. It also helped expand trade among European countries. So by tackling the imbalances through a payment system. So in order to avoid those payment barriers, the Marshall Plan created a payment system. So there is no hurdle in the exchange of goods among these countries, these 16 different countries. In essence, we can say that Marshall Plan was basically the precursor for a united Europe. One can argue that today's Europe is the byproduct of the Marshall Plan. So Marshall Plan was able to achieve such a drastic development in Europe with $100 billion. But let's see what happened in Afghanistan. And we all know what happened, but the book basically tries to bring that to front and explain it. So now I call this Marshall Plan 2.0 Afghanistan in my book because initially when the United States went into Afghanistan on October of 2001, when it launched a US military operation to oust the Taliban, the whole country was taken in 2 months and it was liberated from the Taliban in 2001. Afghanistan in 2001, as I mentioned earlier, was as destroyed as Europe of post-World War II. There were 2 decades of war that had destroyed most of the infrastructure. Government institutions were non-existent. Poverty was at its height. And Afghanistan was the 3rd poorest country in 2001. When President Bush mentioned that he wanted to help rebuild Afghanistan right after taking it from the Taliban. This successful military operation led the Bush administration to a nation-building strategy towards Afghanistan. I mentioned in my book that in 2002, President Bush spoke before the cadets at the Virginia Military Institute, VMI. It's the institution where US Army General George Marshall graduated from. And President Bush invoked the name of George Marshall multiple times. And he said, we will help build a better Afghanistan that's a better place to live in. So he had that vision of Marshall Plan in mind to be able to achieve it in Afghanistan. And during his term, 8 years, Afghanistan was the top aid recipient during the period of 2001 to 2008. Then comes the President Obama, and we all know that he increased the troop levels. He adapted a coin strategy, counterinsurgency strategy, where he increased the number of troops in Afghanistan that was coupled with increase in development aid money. And during his tenure in office, between 2011 and 2012, the development aid reached till $13 billion a year. That's where the development aid peaked in Afghanistan. That's a large sum of money for a small country like Afghanistan. Unfortunately, when the Trump administration came into power, the development aid reduced and it came down to about $2.4 billion a year. That was the overall sort of like a Trump administration policy to reduce aid. But in total, the US and all international development partners basically spent $143 billion in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, $143 billion. That's 50% more than what was spent on Marshall Plan. And 64% of this was spent on government governance, and 29% of this was spent on development, basically humanitarian assistance. So, and we have to distinguish between the humanitarian assistance of this $143 billion and $815 billion was spent on military operations. So that's primarily the US spending on its military personnel, on operations and counterinsurgency strategies, on all that. So that's 80%, but $143 billion was particularly spent on humanitarian assistance, which is still 50% larger than what was spent on Marshall Plan. When we come to the human cost, there was 2,448 US service members killed over the last 20 years in Afghanistan. 66,000, that's a very conservative estimate of Afghan military and police died in the last 20 years in this fight. And the number of civilians surpassed more than 100,000 people. That's also conservative numbers. There were also journalists and humanitarian workers who also lost their lives and paid the ultimate sacrifice in this war. Now, the question that the book tries to answer is, why did we fail to develop a sustainable economy for Afghans? Despite having spent $143 billion, we still did not achieve an economy so Afghans could rely on today when they're in that situation and they need it. And the book outlines three main reasons. The first one is the misalignment of priorities. Basically, the priorities of the donors and the Afghan government did not really align. Only 35% of the overall aid was spent through the Afghan government. The remaining 65% was at the discretion of donor agencies and donor countries. So initially, there was a hesitancy. There was lack of trust on the Afghan government that they won't be able to spend the aid, the foreign aid effectively. But slowly that amount increased, and almost 50% of the donor aid was channeled through the Afghan national budget. But still, that process was very slow. It took years, more than 10 years. In 2015, they started to spend more money through the Afghan government. Every country had its own agenda, priorities for what they wanted to spend on. Their priorities, in most cases, were not aligned with that of the Afghan government in terms of long-term programs, building dams, sort of creating market, investing in the agriculture sector, or just creating an internal market-oriented economy. That was not really in focus of most of the donor countries. So donors were often fixated on short-term, sort of like a quick turnaround projects to show the results for their constituents for the next election in their home countries, be it in Europe or being it in the United States. That short-term vision really hurt the priority and misaligned the priorities between the Afghan government and the donors. One of the prime examples of this misalignment is basically the US Agency of Global Media, USAGM, which runs the Voice of America, Dari and Pashto language, was funded $281 million over the last 10 years. But in comparison, the US State Department exchange program, through which I came to the United States, it helped me and millions of other Fulbrighters, was only awarded $96 million over 20 years. So that's a huge comparison. So Voice of America compared to exchange programs that would help Afghans build their capacity. Also, data shows that for every $100 spent on narcotics control, only $9 was spent on child health. So there's a huge discrepancy there as well. $100 on narcotics control, which still Afghanistan is the largest narcotic opium producing country, but $9 on child health. So there was something wrong there as well. So reason number two is lack of ownership that I outlined in my book. So unlike the Marshall Plan, most projects for Afghanistan were designed either in Washington, Paris, London, rather than being in Kabul and helping it develop in consultation with the Afghan government and the locals. That did not really happen. Most of the embassies and these development institutions were bunkered in their embassies and development agency offices. They rarely came out of their offices. Most donor agencies work directly with ministries to implement certain projects of their choosing, rather than talking to the one institution at the Ministry of Finance. We had the Donor Coordination Directorate, which was rarely involved in this process of basically developing these projects. So the embassies, the development agencies would directly go and talk to certain ministries and implement their projects there. This resulted in sort of duplication of projects. One embassy or one development agency would work on the same project with one ministry, and they would work on the same project with another ministry. That created sort of like duplication, and instead of complementation. So there was no complementation, but rather duplication of a lot of these projects. And as we all know, Afghanistan is a patronage society. So most often, these local elders, influential figures in the region, they were ignored throughout the process. They were not brought in as to consult with them and let them sort of be the owners of these projects and take control of it. So later the Taliban would not come in and destroy it or create problems for those projects. And one of the example is the Kabul Kandahar road that I talk about in my book. It's a 300 miles long road from Kabul to Kandahar. It was one of the largest and the first development projects of USAID in post-war reconstruction efforts. The original cost was basically $162 million, which ended up costing more than $300 million. Each mile of the road basically cost $1 million to the US taxpayers. Contractors basically brought in Chinese, Turkish, and Indian workers from their countries to help rebuild this road instead of using the local manpower. You know, you don't need technical expertise, but you can at least use the manpower that's there in those localities in the suburbia of Afghanistan to help build this country, so they can feel that connection in that project. So as a result of this lack of ownership, New York Times reported in 2015 that this Kabul Kandahar road became sort of like a highway of debt. It was built with a great expenditure as a symbol of achievement for the United States, to show to the region and to Afghans that if you side with the United States, these are the dividends that you would get. But as a result, it became a highway of debt. The Taliban sort of planted IEDs along this road to sort of attack the NATO convoy, supply convoys that would come to Kabul. Local elders, they also tried to get bribes along the road. So there a lot of issues came into being. Had there been local ownerships, those elders would intervene and take care of a lot of these issues, because the Talibans were coming out of those localities, those suburbia. So that lack of ownership resulted in this major failure for this big project that the United States undertook initially. The third component and the third reason that I outlined in my book is lack of mutual accountability. So while the government of Afghanistan basically reported to the donors every 2 years on their progress on the commitments that they had made in various pledging conferences for Afghanistan, most donors, they did not really abide by some of those commitments that they made in those conferences with the Afghan government. I remember at the Ministry of Finance, one of my job tasks was to basically work with the embassies and these development agencies to see the progress of these commitments made at the Brussels conference and at the Tokyo conference. Those are two big pledging conferences that were held in 2014 and in 2016. Most of the commitments made by the Afghan government were fulfilled, because otherwise the money would not flow into the Afghan government's budget. But some of the commitments made by the international donors were not abided by. And one of the prime example is that they wanted, the commitment was that they need to align their projects with the government's national priority programs. They, up until the last minute in 2018, when I left, they did not really committed to that commitment that they made. They also made commitments to report to the government of Afghanistan on their project results, which never happened. There was a system built at the Ministry of Finance where these development agencies could report their results and their project progresses and their expenditure and everything. They never used that portal. They never used that programming in order so that Afghan government also understands what's going on with these projects. None of these commitments were fulfilled over the last 20 years. And post hoc, after the effect, then the government would learn from the Special Inspector General report, the CIGAR report that we all know. That's basically a government entity that was looking over the development, the reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan. They will audit the US's expenditure in Afghanistan. The Pentagon spent more than $28 million on Afghan army camouflage. That was in basically the patterns of that camouflage was basically lush forest. So Afghanistan terrain is, as we all know, it's lush forest doesn't really resemble that. It's a desert. It's mostly mountainous. So the $28 million was just wasted. And after the effect, we would learn that these things took effect and the money was just wasted. Therefore, because of these three aforementioned reasons that I just mentioned, the short-sightedness investment by donors, the lack of sort of like long-term projects, created an environment of perpetual aid dependency. So up until 2020, the budget shows that more than 50% of the Afghan national budget was comprised of foreign aid. So in other words, Afghanistan's total expenditure, half of it was paid by the donors. That's how dependent the Afghan economy was on this donor foreign aid. So therefore, as a result, when on August 15, when the Taliban came into power, that development aid, the foreign aid, stopped. So a lot of those teachers, doctors, nurses, and hospitals that were basically paid through these foreign aids, they never received their payments. They haven't been paid for the last 6 or 7 months. So basically, there's a lack of cash or liquidity in the market, and that's why people are at the level of starvation that we're faced with, the humanitarian crisis that we're faced with today. So finally, I'll end with this. How do I foresee the future of aid to Afghanistan? How to break from this perpetual cycle of aid dependency? In the book, I recommend basically that we need a massive intervention like the Marshall Plan. Rather than having these donor conferences every 4 years that happened in the last 20 years, the international community needs to commit to sort of like a large sum of money, a one-time aid like the Marshall Plan, to help jumpstart the Afghan economy, the local market economy of Afghanistan. And these funds must be heavily invested, directly or indirectly associated with private sector. Businesses could be loan money, they could start a startup, they could, the agriculture sector could be helped sort of with their expertise, with the high yield crops and all that. So I think that the domestic economy needs to be at the forefront of this. And the government of Afghanistan, despite the fact that Taliban are in control, and I don't think that they have the capacity to do this, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt, they must sort of adopt economic policies that would help the private sector, spur this private sector growth. And we need this market-oriented development approach to get out of this perpetual aid dependency from Afghanistan. So I'll end it right there, and I'm pretty sure that there might be questions that we could discuss some of these parts. Thank you.
Abid, thank you very much. It sounds like an incredible book, and we're very proud of you at the International Development Studies program. And of course, this event's about you and your book and about Afghanistan, but I do want to ask one self-centered question to start things off, and then I have a couple more questions, then we'll open it up to the audience for further questions. Is there any lessons you learned from the IDS program at GW that helped you write this book?
I think I write about this in my book as well. Right after I graduated in 2015 from the IDS program, I returned back to Afghanistan. One of the reasons that I joined the IDS program was that development aid really hits home with me and a lot of Afghans, because my generation, we basically grew up in poverty and migration. Some of us either lived in Pakistan as refugees or Iran or the rest of the world. And we remember getting these development aid through USAID, and through World Food Program. And when I came out of that sort of poverty to go and study at George Washington University. So development aid really helps in most cases. And IDS program really prepared me, bring that to my understanding as to how development aid needs to be distributed, how it needs to be effective in a country like Afghanistan. When I was at the Ministry of Finance, and since Afghanistan was so heavily dependent on foreign aid, a lot of the skills that I had learned at the IDS program, including the capstone projects, that we had to work on certain projects, and give me sort of like a hands-on experience that I could take it with me and develop those proposals and other documentation that we needed in order to help further those projects.
Great. Well, that's thank you very much for the plug. Now I have two other questions. I guess first, you've outlined a lot of egregious errors in the way that development assistance was provided to Afghanistan. Why do you think the international development community failed Afghanistan in those ways? Was it a lack of interest? Again, if we take the comparison with the Marshall Plan, did the US have less at stake in rebuilding Afghanistan? Or was it a lack of trust? Or was it just poor management and poor planning?
I think the U.S. administration and a lot of these countries who helped sort of channel aid money, give money to Afghanistan, wanted to see good progress in Afghanistan. I think the intention was right. But what happened was the implementation, and Dr. Roberts, you know this better than anybody, that implementation is like the key to all this. There was a mismanagement in the parts of the Afghan government and also these international development partners, including the World Bank, the UN, and also these bilateral development agencies, USAID and DFID and all these other institutions. They did not really came together to sort of speak the same language, and I think that's what I felt. I played a very key role in organizing the Brussels conference on Afghanistan, which was held in 2016, where $15 billion were raised for Afghanistan for 4 years. In preparation for that conference, it took us about a year and a half to work with all these different embassies who were involved and who were donating, pledging to the Afghan development, and have been pledging for the last 16 or 17 years, that they had different priorities. They wanted sort of like a quick turnaround project where they could just show it, take a picture, put it on their names on a plaque and show it to their capitals that this is what we did. Women empowerment, for instance, there was one of the projects, and capacity building projects. Of course, those were needed initially, but I think you need something substantial that could last longer. Those capacity building projects, most of those Afghans who were helped build their capacity have left Afghanistan, the brain drain. They're all now in Europe and America.
And my last question is, when the US pulled out of Afghanistan, there was a lot of analysts talking about, China is going to come in and seize an opportunity to really be present in Afghanistan. Do you think China's approach through the Belt and Road Initiative could be more successful in Afghanistan, given that they are focused on infrastructure, they're focused on building trade networks? Is that going to be a potential success?
That's a really good question. And I think the Taliban are turning towards China and Pakistan for those regional connectivity projects. Belt and Road Initiative is one of them. We have TAPI, sort of Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India gas pipeline. There's like a TAP, that's another regional project, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan electricity project. There's a CASA 1000, which is another electricity project from Kyrgyzstan to Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and then Pakistan. So Taliban are turning towards those regional connectivity projects when there's no development aid. But from my point of view, I think at this point where Afghans are starving, those projects could help in the long term, but in the immediate term, I think there's a development assistance needed in order to spur the domestic economy. So those linkages could be helpful in sort of finding markets for the Afghan goods and services and the rest. But if you just help them build these roads and transfer energy from the stans, from the northern part to the southern part of Pakistan and India, you're helping those countries. So Afghanistan will not really benefit from these regional connectivity projects unless they have a good, at least a starting economy.
Very good, very good. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. That it's a lot is going to depend on the capacity of the present Afghan government. Yeah. So we have a few questions. The first one is from Catherine Riley, who asks whether the U.S. government was truly committed to women's rights in Afghanistan, or was women's empowerment merely a mechanism for rallying support for the U.S. led war and rebuilding effort in Afghanistan domestically?
I think the U.S. has done a lot of good as well. So I'm the byproduct of one of the projects. I came here as a high school exchange student. I went back to Afghanistan. I came back and studied in a very prestigious universities here. And like me, there are a lot of other Fulbrighters and everyone else. So including men, women, and children who went to school right after 9/11. There were no girls in school back then. So there was some progress, but those progress were not really tangible. They didn't really last. And the human capital, the buildup that they helped do in the last 20 years, it just dissipated right on August 15 when the airplanes started to lift people out, and that brain drain is hurting the country, and there is very few people left in Kabul to sort of help support this country, this current government. So women empowerment, I think they did a lot. Women, they got their voices, and we see them now out on the streets. They want their rights. They want to go back to work. They want all the rights that they had previously. So those voices did not exist in 2001 initially. So those were suppressed, and the women didn't really know that they had those voices. But today they do. So that's a great progress. And today's Afghanistan, in that term, is a totally different Afghanistan than it was 20 years ago. No doubt about that. But just the fact that the economy is not there to help them sustain is the biggest challenge, in my point of view.
So another, this is not an exactly easy question from Jean Montgomery. Could you elaborate on what exactly is involved in getting local buy-in? And maybe you could add to that what could have been done differently to actually establish local buy-in?
So in terms of local buy-in, I think consultation with the local elders. So Afghanistan, as I just mentioned, it's a patronage society. The local elders and the mullahs in there and the mosques, they have a lot of say, they have a lot of power than the central government does. So I think just bringing them in the consultation in sort of like the proposal phase and get their feedback as to what their needs are, what they really want, and how could their people, whatever they have could be used in this project. And the Kabul-Kandahar road is a prime example. People from those regions, it's just manpower. For a lot of construction work, you need just people to move things around. Those locals could be used, and they would feel more entitled to those projects. They would help save those projects, and as a result, they would have an income. But in turn, what happened was a lot of those young people, they turned to the Taliban and they start plotting IEDs along that road because they didn't really feel that entitlement for that road. And similar to that, a lot of other projects that were designed for Afghanistan, particularly the construction projects that were there, that Afghans were not really taken into account through the process.
We have another question. I actually have two questions. I'll see if I can combine them from Glenn Ulmer. He applauds your informative comments and says that you make excellent points, but he was struck that there was not much discussion of the government or the local Afghan responsibility, to what degree the government engaged donors in a way that could have redirected them towards the right area. And I'll just add on top of that, he mentions, he asked whether you think the Taliban is interested in market-oriented reform in the economic sector, as you think is one of the keys to really building back Afghanistan in a sustainable way.
That's a really good question. And I think the blame goes, so I hope it didn't come across as that I'm just squarely blaming the international partners and the international involved, but not the local Afghan sort of government. I think it's 50-50. The Afghan government did not really engage with the donors. They also had a stake in this. Corruption was a big challenge that they were not able to contain throughout the 20 years. That the contractual process, the contracting process that the Afghan government had built had a lot of loopholes that provided ways for people to misuse these funds. And sometimes you would even go to the Taliban that they would have more resources that they could use against the government and the international partners. So there's a lot of blame to go around, and the government, the Afghan government, they're also they were in charge of the government. They were not able to get their priorities straight either. As I mentioned, my job at the Ministry of Finance was to sort of align the national priority programs with the donors. One day we would have 10 priorities for the national government, and the next day we will receive a directorate from the president's office that we have 8 priorities. So they would build these Afghan national development strategy papers and present them to the donors, but they were just wish lists. So they were not really substantiated in facts and something that they could go back and implement it in Afghanistan. It was just a way for them to show to the development partners that we're serious in this effort and we need your money, and that you can come in and bring the money and give it to us for the next 4 years. So there's a lot of blame to go towards the Afghan government as well, that they were not able to get their priorities straight either, and that resulted in lack of basically trust of the development partners in the Afghan government, corruption plus not getting their priorities straight. And the second part, I'm sorry, I'm blinking on the.
Well, he was wondering whether you think the Taliban has an interest in market-oriented.
That's a really good question. I doubt it, because I don't see the capacity. What the Taliban have done is basically they've pushed aside all those people who had worked in the last 20 years. They have the institutional knowledge in all these ministries and the government aside, and that has created sort of like a knowledge vacuum in these institutions. And they've brought in all these their fighters who are up in the mountains over the last 20 years, and now they're in Kabul and running these institutions with very little knowledge or understanding of those institutions. So I hope it changes in the future, but I doubt it.
Another question that kind of relates to one of the things you said about the lack of trust. This is from Iris Stankich, who is asking about whether there were conditionalities that the Afghan government had to fulfill in order to receive international aid, and whether you thought that hampered that trust or hampered the delivery of assistance.
There definitely was. So there were a lot of, in every single conference. So in my book, I outline all those conferences, starting from Tokyo conference in 2002. There had been almost 6 or 7 different conferences where more than $15 billion was pledged for Afghanistan for every 4 years. So in each one of these conferences, there were indicators, there were commitments from the international community on the Afghan government in order to fulfill, for them to be able to get this money. And there was also commitments that the international partners pledged that they will abide by as well. So in the Brussels conference, the one that I was involved in, the government met almost 90% of their commitments made in the previous conference, because they had to, otherwise the money would not flow in, and the government wanted that money. So even though if it met sort of like 80% of their desired wish list, the international partners would give that money to the Afghan government. So the Afghan government was committed to fulfilling their commitments, but the international partners, the international community, they did not really abide. And because the Afghan government did that because they wanted the money, and they wanted to fulfill. And those commitments were not very, I would say it again, it was not very market oriented or something tangible. It was just like, you have to allow certain number of girls into school, then you meet this threshold, this benchmark, and then we will give this certain amount of money to capacity building in teachers or their salaries and things like that. So it was not really directed to building the market economy.
Here's a series of complex questions from Malcolm Russell Einhorn, who's a research professor here and has also done a lot of development work. He's wondering whether European or multilateral donors were pushing the U.S. in favor of channeling more funds to the Ministry of Finance and other local channels that you saw as important. And he's also asking whether, regardless of the channels where funds were sent through, do you think the absorptive capacity of the country via the mass amount of funds was an additional problem? Did it invariably stoke corruption? And did that in many ways, and bringing up another point, it seems critical that building a social contract between citizens and the government's important, with that corruption or even imagined corruption around that. Did that turn the population increasingly against the government?
Exactly. I think the professor is basically pointing in the right direction. In the Brussels conference, we raised $5 billion for infrastructure projects. But in 2020, the Afghan government ministries were able to spend less than 50% of their development budget. So just imagine, the international partners, they committed $5 billion, $1 billion each year for building these regional connectivity roads, bridges, and all the other things outlined in the infrastructure plan that I helped design for the Brussels conference. But the Afghan government, as the professor rightly mentioned, did not have the capacity to sort of go out there and build the proposals and bring it to the international community, to the donor agencies, to get the money and implement it. And that was an issue. That was definitely an issue. And in some parts, even if they attracted the money, corruption, the way the contracts were given out, the President Ashraf Ghani brought that into the presidential palace. There was a a high-level sort of meeting that would take place to give certain contracts to certain companies, but that was marred by corruption as well. So, there was a mentality of basically these grants and programs in Afghanistan, which was not getting out, and no one was thinking of opening up a business in order to help themselves, but rather than they were looking for a project, for a program from a certain organization to get and sort of make money out of that. And of course, corruption was part of it. They wanted to keep more of that money to themselves.
So we have a question from Kimia Hashimi Nejad, who's asking about what you think will happen now with Pakistan's role. Will the Pakistan government help Afghanistan more now that the Taliban's in charge? And if so, is it possible that Pakistan could be more successful than the US due to their long-term relationship with the Taliban?
Well, every country is looking for their own self-interest. So Pakistan is happy that they have a puppet government just in Kabul. They would do whatever the Pakistan establishment asks him to do. As I mentioned earlier, Pakistan is very glad that that government is there so they could fulfill those projects, those regional connectivity projects. As we all know, Pakistan is hugely energy deficit, and all those stans, they have a lot of energy, and Pakistan needs that energy in order to spur their domestic economy. And we know that Pakistan's economy has been suffering for the last 10 years. So they are very happy to help the Taliban implement those TAP projects, CASA 1000 projects, to get that energy to Sialkot, where they could start their industrial production and export it across the country, across the world, and also to Afghanistan. So it's in their self-interest to have a puppet government and a little bit of stability so they could implement their regional connectivity projects for their own economy.
Sorry about that. We have a last question, and this is looking forward, and not in Afghanistan, but for the many Afghans who arrived in the US last fall. It's from Stanley Gonzalez Martinez, and he's noting that many of these Afghan arrivals will not qualify for SIV, and they will need to apply for other forms of immigration relief. Do you believe that the US has the political will to assist these recent arrivals, or will they be forgotten now that the US has left Afghanistan?
Well, I think it's beyond my capacity to answer that question, but most likely those Afghans will be resettled. I know quite a number of them who are here, who left Afghanistan on the day when the Taliban took over. Americans are very generous people. Even if the government does not do anything, I think there's a lot of other institutions who are helping these immigrants who are in the bases here. So I don't see an issue for them, legally, one way or another. They will be allowed to stay in the United States, and they will be helped to the fullest extent. And I know I've seen that firsthand with a lot of people that I know.
Well, thank you very much, Abid, and I hope all of the people in the audience will now immediately run out and buy your book. And those of you who do not have a master's degree yet, you might decide to join the IDS program so you can become as professional in your analysis of development as Abid. So thank you very much, Abid. We wish you all the success.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Roberts. Thank you, Elaine. I really appreciate this platform. Thanks a lot.
Yes, I just want to give my thanks as well. Really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you all to the attendees. the GW community and beyond. I know we had people outside campus as well today. We have certainly many alumni events coming up that are open to students, faculty, community members. So always check back online at alumni.gwu.edu/events, or you may get emails from me as well directly. And again, I will be sharing the recording with everyone once it's posted online. So thank you again.